2016 marks the 40th anniversary of the Big Thompson flood of 1976, arguably the worst flash flood in Colorado history. The survivors' stories remain a vivid example of the dangers that come with weather in Colorado. 144 people lost their lives, and remembering them and the lessons learned from the flood helped save lives when the canyon flooded again in 2013. And now, Colorado experience, the Big Thompson flood.
The Big Thompson flood of 1976 was a seminal event.
It's the top 10 most lethal flood in the 20th century United States.
It's hard to relate to in this day and time because of our early warning and widespread news coverage, but then there wasn't any of that.
15 minutes, it happened that quick, it just bam.
That night so changed all of our lives.
Nobody recognizes the force of water until they're caught in it.
The Big Thompson flood was a night of panic, of terror. You had floodwaters peak at 20 feet above a normal level.
Intense and sudden risk, and to make clear-headed choices about climb, get up. Other people making choices, well, I'll just wait this out.
The flood caught thousands of unprepared people, tearing through the canyon, destroying houses and property, and claiming the lives of 144 people.
This program was funded by the History Colorado State Historical Fund,
supporting projects throughout the state to preserve, protect, and interpret Colorado's architectural and archaeological treasures. History Colorado State Historical Fund. Create the future, honor the past.
with support from the Denver Public Library History Colorado, with additional funding and support from these fine organizations. And viewers like you, thank you.
The Big Thompson River flows down from Rocky Mountain National Park through Big Thompson Canyon and comes out at Loveland, Colorado.
It's just one of the prettiest canyons in the state. It's one of our best kept secrets.
The American West is so shaped by images of expectation and success that when a really significant calamity hits, there's just a great collision between what the West is supposed to be and what it has delivered. And to a large degree, totally was a beautiful natural setting that turned murderous and treacherous and betrayed the dreams and the hopes and the expectations of the people who had placed their homes there.
It's had a number of devastating flash floods in different parts of the state.
There are estimates from the Pueblo flood from anywhere from 75 to 1,500. And the fact is people simply weren't keeping good records in the Pueblo flood of 1921, so we don't know. But 144 is an unbearable number of people to lose their lives.
In terms of loss of life, the Big Thompson flood is the deadliest flood in Colorado's history. It's the top 10 most lethal flood in the 20th century United States history.
But it was a bad place to have that sort of a flood because of the narrowness of the canyon, the concentration of the waters from the two tributaries coming together, and the surge that you got on top of the fact that there were so many people there.
The Weather Service talks about 50-year floods and 100-year floods and 500-year floods, and these are sort of actuarial numbers that allow the government and insurers to make some projections about the severity of flood damage and the frequency of those kinds of floods.
The canyon hadn't experienced floodwaters like the 1976 flood for the last 10,000 years. So since the end of the last ice age.
Nobody ever thought a flood of that magnitude would come down through here.
So many things went wrong in the 1976 Big Thompson flood. I hate to say it, it was a perfect storm.
Human actions and decisions were shaping the Big Thompson Canyon for decades before the flood itself. The first road was built in 1904 by William A. Riley, a crude single-lane dirt road, gravel. It served early tourism for Estes Park region. When you have the Great Depression and New Deal, the National Industrial Recovery Act opens up all this federal funding for building new highways or renovating old ones.
The Highway Department had constructed US Highway 34 through Big Thompson Canyon in a way that straightened out a lot of the curves that would have normally slowed down the floodwaters as they came down the canyon.
And so instead of paying attention to the mountain river, there's more attention paid to the mountain road, which leads to all sorts of hydrological impacts. They realigned the river in some 27 junctures throughout the canyon,
turning Big Thompson into essentially a straight chute down onto the plains.
The Big Thompson Canyon experienced flooding 12 times before 1976, including a substantial flood in the 1950s. However, nothing more than a few bridges and the road were ever affected, giving residents a false sense of security.
Tourism had been growing in Colorado since the Second World War, and Colorado in the summertime was seeing more tourists than it ever had before.
So much so that from the 1960s to the 1970s, highway traffic on US 34 quadruples. By 1964, you had 32 motels in the Big Thompson Canyon and Devil's Gulch, supplemented by campgrounds. You had at least one hotel or campground for every mile of road up the Big Thompson Canyon.
In Colorado, we can enjoy beautiful weather, times of great abundance, and at other times, the weather can be extreme. The federal government, the Army Corps of Engineers, had recognized this, and the Corps of Engineers in 1971 issued a report warning that catastrophic floods were reasonably likely in Big Thompson Canyon. In fact, they predicted that a serious flood could happen once every 6 years.
And they basically came to the recommendation that floodplain zoning needs to occur in the near future, and had given the recommendation that people need to be purchasing flood insurance because they're living on the waterfront.
So many homeowners were confident that they were high enough above the river that they turned down the opportunity to buy flood insurance when they had it.
The Big Thompson flood was a product of bad timing.
Coming out of Vietnam, coming out of Watergate, 1976 was supposed to be the year where we began to pull it back together, both with the National Bicentennial and the Centennial of Colorado.
On the weekend of July 31st through August 1st, 1976, you had the 100th anniversary of Colorado's statehood. You also had the 200th anniversary of United States nationhood.
Some 4,000 people were camping or staying in lodges or hiking in the Big Thompson Canyon on July 31st, the day of the flood.
The whole state was coming together to celebrate, and then instead of celebrating, we mourned.
You got to remember, this is 40 years ago. We didn't have the early warning weathercast that we have today. None of the attention from the news media that we do today.
When you look at weather history, there are certain aspects of technology that have really advanced our field. And one of them has been weather radar, which is microwaves being transmitted from an antenna. The first operational weather radar for the National Weather Service was installed out in Lyman in 1970. But the farther away you are from that radar, the more general the information that it gives you. It's a long way from Lyman to Estes Park.
The Lyman radar had been either, if not malfunctioning, then they had it turned to read too high or too low, or it was down for recalibration.
The National Weather Service did issue a few statements, but many of those didn't reach the people that needed to hear them, the people in the canyon themselves.
The fact that the flood hit at night, that it had a bunch of people who were just having a pleasant day, and no sirens, no signals.
The only way that people learned about the potential of the flood was through word of mouth. But the word of the flood could not move faster than the floodwaters itself in many cases. On July 31st, 1976, two fronts collided. A northern cold front and a warm front hit right over Big Thompson Canyon, and it changed the weather pattern in a way that people didn't predict. Normally, as in the summertime, thunderheads slide down the front range of the Rocky Mountains and out onto the plains.
Basically had these clouds that were literally stationary from about 6:30 p.m. to 11 p.m.
The rainfall was as much as 12 inches in 6 hours, with some areas approaching that in only 4 hours of time.
So by the time it started coming down, it was picking up volume. And when it picked up volume, it picked up trees, it picked up houses, it picked up all these things, and it dammed up. Then it would break loose, and that would cause more damage. Then it would break loose again. We knew there was a bad storm because it had thundered all day long. And we had a little dog that hated thunder, and he was under our feet all day long. My daughter, Tina, had her 9th birthday.
My best friend, Teresa Graham, she called me up and asked if I could spend the night. And my mom said no, and I did the typical 9-year-old thing. But why?
I said, because I said so. It was a good thing she did not go over there, because she would have been probably with them in the car.
I watched my wife and 2 girls get washed away. Their names were Teresa and Lisa. They were 8 and 4. And my mother also, I saw her. They lived 2 doors north of me, and Dad had been off on a rescue mission with the fire truck. It saved him from the flood. We're the only 2 survivors of our total families. We had built a house on the river 75 or 80 feet from the river's edge. It was no different than any other July day, except it started getting cloudy, which was not unusual. And being accustomed to the water coming up just from snowmelt didn't bother me at first until it started getting up close to the house. I'd never had it up that close, and that's when I sent my wife and the 2 daughters out to get in a car. I thought we would be able to drive out of there. I watched car and truck-sized boulders roll in the water in the channel, because from up on the roof I had a very good view of the channel of the river. It was fairly dark. I was just so familiar with the surroundings that I knew where everything was. The smell was from the discharged propane. When a propane tank is very buoyant and water comes up under it, it knocks it off its resting place. Most of them are 1,000 and 2,000 gallon propane tanks. I just remember the sounds and the pressure of the big boulders and propane tanks rolling through the river, and the ground would shake a little bit, and even I could feel that through the roof on the house. Some of those big boulders that went by were as big as the house nearly.
We had a phone call from our neighbor, Alice Gifford, up by Waltonia. She said, "Barb, get out now. Get your family out. Tell all the neighbors and get them out. The Waltonia Bridge is gone." And then she said, "The motel's gone too." And as we were going out the door, the electricity went off, which meant it hit the power plant, which is just a quarter of a mile.
About 9:30, Mom and Dad came in. Mom got us up and said, "We need to get in the car. We gotta go." We tried to get our dog out, Stubby. Never a growly dog, never a barky dog, but he was back there growling at Dad. He wouldn't come out.
I kept hearing this noise, this horrible noise. Well, I grabbed Fern's flashlight and I went over to the side of her house and I shined it out there. And I didn't tell anybody what I saw, but it was boards and water shooting on the other side of the wall of the river. And it was going really fast and furious. And I just thought, we got to get out of here. We got up on the highway and we spent the night there.
It was dark. It was pitch black. I remember getting out of the car a couple of times. My dad's voice was what I heard. He was protecting me. There were screams of people in the river. And the roaring of that river and the rocks grinding, cars, homes. You could smell the propane.
We didn't sleep. If they hadn't warned us, we would have been right there in our house. And I don't know what we would have done.
I was 22 years old, and I was dating a young girl there, and I was renting a house off of her dad. His name was Ely, and Mary Lee, and Sandy was the girl. And we were in her house watching television about 9 o'clock, and we got a knock on the door, and it was the fire chief's wife. And they suggested we go out to the river and get the pumps out of the river. And the water was down about 3-4 feet down there. And I started taking those bolts off, and when I got to the fourth bolt, which didn't take a lot of time, the water was lapping over the bridge. He had some chickens out by the river. So I ran out to the river to get him, gave me these 2 birds to put on my arms. We were probably 20 feet from the river at that time. Water was at my ankles, and the water just came up so fast that it came up to my waist in a matter of just a couple seconds. We got rid of the birds. We were in about 3 feet probably at that time. I put my arms around him to get ready to lift him up on the shed, and at that time the shed and everything just gave loose and we started tumbling. And so I still had my left arm around Ely, and I was throwing my right arm trying to get above water because we were just tumbling in the water and underwater. And it was the strangest thing, my arm got caught in the fork of a tree. And it stopped us. I mean, it about almost jerked my arm out of the socket, but it stopped us. So I was hanging in this tree. The water went over the top of us, so we were trapped there in the water. And I knew that if I let go of him, I could probably get out of that tree, but I wouldn't let go of him. Ely was 63. He was in pretty good health. I was in excellent health. I was, a logger, young, strapping. And that tree just uprooted, and we started tumbling downstream again. And I got my feet under me, and I had my arms around Ely, and I just leaned back into the water, and I finally got us stopped. And the water was about chest level. Things were flying all around us. Oh, we were sure we were gonna die. And the camper just shot right by us, missed us by 2 feet. And Ely looked me in the eye like this, and he said, "I bet you wish you'd kept that camper on your truck now, don't you?" And I thought, wow, he's pretty calm. I'm just scared to death here. Up above us, Idlewild Dam had kind of stuff had piled up on it, trees, houses. Well, that broke loose, and it sent a 19-foot wall of water was coming at us. And when it hit us, it just bent me over double, but it didn't pull us away. I was seeing those stars again because I was running out of oxygen, and Ely, well, that's when he died. He went limp in my arms. And so I knew he'd either drowned or maybe a heart attack, I don't know, but I knew he was gone. The water just took us away at that time. It started tumbling. There was a 20-foot telephone pole stuck into these 3 pine trees, and I hit the end of that telephone pole with my neck, and that's when I fractured my neck. But I was able to throw my arms around that telephone pole and hang there. I was hanging there, and then the water went over my head again. So I was trapped underwater again. My next memory is I'm over at the camper. I climbed up on the top of my camper in those trees, and I broke the windows out, and I pulled out 3 cushions about 2 foot by 5 foot. As I was sitting on that camper, propane tanks would shoot by, and they would sound like torpedoes, just hissing. Trees, cars, everything was going by. Things were crashing into the tree. And as the water started getting to the top of the camper, I took my cushions and I climbed up about 10 more feet, and then the water kept coming up. I went as high as I could go. I made a little nest with my cushions, and the water was coming up, and I was thinking, man, after all that, I'm gonna get washed out of this tree. And all of a sudden the lightning flashed, and I looked up, and just in time to see it, there was a giant white wall. It was a house coming right at the trees, and I saw it just in time to throw those cushions over my head. And when it hit that tree, it was just like a bomb went off. It actually shot shards of glass and wood went through those cushions and stuck into me. I just got lacerated everywhere. I'd lost my shirt and my shoes. Like I had a tight belt on, I would probably lost my pants. And I got on top of a roof. Just waited a couple more hours, and the water went down. It was so dark, I'd wait till the lightning would flash, and I thought, okay, well, I know where I'm at now. If I go this way, I have to hit their house. And the lightning flashed, and the house was gone. And here, Mary and Sandy they walked up. They just walked right to us. And when it happened, It picked their house up, and they didn't know it moved because everything was going up and down, and it took their house down about 300 yards, the distance of a football field probably, turned it and set it sideways on top of another house. But we managed to get a fire going on the hillside and got all of our friends and neighbors and stayed there till the next morning. I had a fractured neck and just lacerations and bruises everywhere, but I made it out. You know, I made it out alive.
My mother is Lois McCargo, and she was 63 years old. She loved this canyon. She'd always wanted to build a house. My father had passed not too long before that, and she had only lived there since January of 1976. It was a brand new house. We were told by people to the west that they could see her in the house, and it appeared she was frantic. And then the wall of water hit and it swept the house and contents and her with it.
I had a 7-year-old daughter, a 3.5-year-old son, and then I had a brand new baby, 3.5 weeks old. My in-laws had a beautiful A-frame cabin up the Big Thompson. As we were eating dinner, I remember the water rushed into the cabin. Gary slams that door and he says, grab the kids, get a jacket on them. We've got to go out the back door and get up the mountainside. He said the river has already risen to the base of the cabins. By that time, the river had risen 7-8 feet. Within just a few minutes, the water had risen on the glass. The glass was from the floor clear up to the ceiling, and the weight of the water broke that glass. So now we're trying to move around in shards of glass and grabbing kids and trying to be able to get out that back door. Within a couple of minutes, propane tanks were now inside of the cabin, pushing up against the back door. We could not get that door open. We were absolutely prisoners within the house. We went into the adjacent bedroom. My ex took a piece of driftwood off of one of the dressers and just took it and broke one of the windows open. So the water was rising inside of the cabin and going around the cabin now. And I just looked at that little hole and I thought, we're not gonna make it out. I had the diaper bag on this arm. My ex was holding the baby, the 3.5-week-old baby, and I just took my arm and I went like this and broke out the adjacent window. And I looked down and I could see my arm was completely opened up. I had almost completely cut my arm off, and blood was just spattering all over all the walls, and this incredible peace came over me. Meanwhile, that water is rising. Had we gone out there, we would have all of us, all 5 of us, been washed down the river. He did take a piece of cloth and made kind of a tourniquet, so it kind of stopped the bleeding for just a little bit. As I was just getting ready to walk out the door into the kitchen area and then up the stairs, the refrigerator went right by me. If I'd gone out there even a split second earlier, it would have killed me. It would have just crushed me. Propane tanks, now we have trees inside of our house. The water continued to rise, and the thunder and the lightning was so horrendous, I can't even tell you how loud it was. By that time, we had lost all electricity. We had a little bit of light from the lightning. So I looked up and I saw this 25-foot wall of water coming towards us. The glass in the very top, that was still intact. I remember seeing that water hit that glass. It was just like, just an explosion. Little Aaron was running towards me. I was trying to grab his hand when the roof just twisted, and I remember the roof hitting my head and pushing me down into the water, and for one split second that roof was on my head, and then the next thing I knew, I was laying over on the side of the mountainside. My ex, he had put the baby, the 3.5-week-old LaShawn, under his t-shirt. Thank goodness, or for sure he would have been washed out of his arms. There's houses going down that river. We're seeing cars going down. I must have hollered Gary or something, and he came over to where I was and he said, "Where's Aaron?" And I said, you know, he's gone. When the roof fell, the whole cabin collapsed, and he was washed on down the river. We heard these cries, Mommy, Daddy, and it was way downstream. He walked on down and found Cindy, the 7-year-old. One of those huge, great big old trees had fallen over into the river, and as she was going down the river, the hood of her jacket caught on one of the limbs. Gary had to get her jacket off of her, pulled her out of the river, and brought her back to where I was, and he just prayed over all of us. And I said, just go up the hill as far and as fast as you can, take the kids. So as I'm laying there, maybe an hour or something before I could even try to move, I'd still see cars going down with people in it. It was a horrific time.
You've got Rocky Mountain National Park rangers, you've got someone trying to reach the National Weather Service, you've got various forms of state and federal agencies who are going to play a part.
I got a call from the Sheriff's Office dispatch. I was pretty naive about floods back then. I didn't really grasp what was going on. We drove up to what is called the Dam Store, which is the last business there just before you get into the Narrows. We saw a constant line of cars coming down Highway 34 right out of the Narrows. And then pretty much all of a sudden the traffic stopped. The road had finally been breached higher up. The crest came down and inundated the bridge and just rose right up. Nobody could get across. We started to see propane tanks in the river and a lot of lumber and some things that really not good to see in a river. And I stayed back at a bridge very near the Big Thompson School. We stayed there all night. One of my vivid memories was feeling Highway 34 vibrating. I went down, touched my fingertips to the pavement. It was vibrating. I thought it was an earthquake, but what it was boulders in the river that were being pushed by the current, just grinding, hitting one another. And I turned my spotlight into the river and saw these things rolling. That's the first time I really, really understood the power of a flooding river. The river smelled like wet sawdust. So many trees, so many boards from houses, just ground up. It's like a rock tumbler, and everything gets ground up.
When the floodwaters receded the morning of August 1st, 1976, you had $35.5 million worth of damage. The flood destroyed 418 homes, damaged another 138 dwellings. It leveled 52 businesses, wrecked 438 vehicles. It even ripped the massive 550-ton water irrigation tube at the canyon entrance from there. We're talking a whole lot of destruction in the aftermath of the flood.
We were operating a helibase on the west side of town in a completely nondescript field. So I got put on a helicopter and we managed to get this deceased woman's body out of the river. She was without any clothing whatsoever, which I thought was really strange. It was the water that ripped the clothes off. And time again we saw bodies without clothes on because of that, just the force of that water ripping the clothes off. That was a real eye-opener. We went down thinking that we were going to be escorting people out, and this was not even remotely close to that. This was a flood where if you went into the river, you pretty much cashed in your chip.
I'm so thankful for all the emergency people, for the patrolmen driving into adverse situations, you know, the police department, the fire departments going in, the EMTs, the first responders. And then there was one man, Butch, that had EMT training. He made it over to where I was. He said, I've seen healthier looking corpses than you. I was completely white. They took my entire family on the helicopter, and then we went up to Estes Park Hospital. My little 3.5-year-old little baby, Sean, he was in pretty bad shape as well. And so they had him in the incubator. The doctor that took care of my son, he never sent a bill in at all. He just said, whatever I can do to help save this family and to make it a little bit easier.
The flood Finally, at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, it subsided some, and I felt safe getting down off the roof of the house and went looking for my family. And of course, they were long gone. Were found several days later, way downriver.
The next morning when we started walking around and seeing things, but there were fish, fish laying out there everywhere. And it had flattened all the beautiful lilac bushes. It was like you were in a war zone. And everything was tore up. Trees was everywhere, and nothing looked right. The whole basement was full of mud and water and debris, and the smell was really bad. And I can still smell that smell. It's never left me. It was so much wastewater, septic tanks, propane tanks. The smell was horrendous.
All of a sudden there's military helicopters, there's flying all over the place. Neighbors were getting together and checking on each other, see who was where. And my best friend Teresa, and her mother Beverly, and Lisa, and Bob, and her grandma Clara and Leroy had not checked in yet, and kept asking where my best friend was.
My wedding rings were in a little heart-shaped box because I always took them off when I was working on something. And so I told the people that had just come in over the mountain that next morning, here they were to start digging everybody out. And I said, I don't care if you find anything, but I want my wedding rings. And they found them in that mess. And they got us out on Sunday morning. We went out in a little bubble helicopter.
The devastation was indescribable. When rescue crews came in after the flood, they found cars flipped up into the air and carried miles downstream. Buildings ripped off of their foundations. A power station was completely destroyed. All that were left were the turbines, but the building around it had been completely carried away. And they began finding bodies as well, stripped of their clothing. People hanging in trees 15 feet above the water. It was a shattering and heartbreaking experience for the rescue teams who were going in and trying to find people. When the flood happened, your chances of survival depended on how you reacted immediately. If you climbed up the side of the mountain, if you went directly up away from the flood zone, your chances of survival were fairly good. If you tried to drive down the canyon, your chances of survival were fairly low.
When they did the searches afterwards, they had to examine every abandoned car they saw to see if there was somebody in it.
The first vehicle I saw that was right next to the river, and the thing was filled with gravel from door to door. If there was a body in there, it was completely buried with gravel, but that's kind of what we were up against.
I had a big pine tree in our yard. I had hung my name and my wife's name, and then 2 smaller signs for the daughters underneath it. And my name was the only one left hanging. All the other 3 were gone. And this sign was probably 12 or 15 feet high on this big pine tree. That was an indication to me that right there that everybody had perished except me.
1 week later, we did have a permit to go in over Climbers Ranch, which is basically just in a 4-wheel drive. And it took us a little while to get our bearings. We weren't sure where we were. Nothing looked the same. The actual place where Mother's house was swept clean with the exception of part of the roof was wrapped around a tree. When we began to look under the roof, we found boxes of Christmas tree ornaments that had survived. They didn't appear to even have gotten wet. But it's amazing because anybody who has those old Christmas tree ornaments, they're so fragile. But not a sign of a car, a sign of the house other than the roof. It's as though someone came in with a very large broom and just swept it clean.
Iva Grant, she was one that was buried up to here. And when they found her, she was yelling and saying, "Get me out of here." They had to dig her out. They said to her, "How did you survive?" And she says, "For the first time in my life, I kept my mouth shut." She was so cute, so cute. And so we had a little humor in all of it.
And I was on the missing list. And my dad was looking at that board with my name that said missing on it. And I walked up behind him. That was a good feeling.
The realization of what had happened was gradual over that night and for the next day.
I remember seeing him at the post office at one point, and I went running up to him, "Hey, Bob." And he couldn't look at me. I didn't understand why then. It took a good many years for me to realize she was really gone, because she's one of the 5 bodies that they never found. Her mom and her little sister, who was 3, and her grandmother were all killed that night. So her father and her grandfather were the only survivors of that family.
The last body or bodies were found maybe out between Loveland and the interstate that had been washed that far out. We pretty much had the bulk of the body recoveries done, I think, within about the first week. We were sifting through debris piles looking for a long time.
They were encouraging people to go to the morgue, start giving information regarding victims that people had heard nothing from. As the days wore on, we still had heard nothing. It was 2.5 weeks before they found her body. And it was Sylvandale Guest Ranch, which is about 5 miles from where her home was. She was identified by dental records.
There was 5 people that was never found. George McCarty, Evelyn Kindred, Teresa Graham, Vernon Oler, and Rochelle Rogers.
One of those was one of our daughters. The younger one was found, the older one was not. While I was walking around, I stepped in some holes that the flood had taken out of, and I think that's probably what happened to her. She fell in one of those holes and then just got covered up by later on flood debris, and that's why she was never found. My dad and I, we looked through a couple of those debris piles, but he did every one of them.
It was weeks later before they ever found Aaron's body, and he was such a beautiful child.
Some accounts claim that 145 people lost their lives, others 144. And the difference was that one person who was believed killed in the flood actually turned up alive and well in Oklahoma some 20 years after the flood had taken place. Big Thompson flood was a shocking moment in what should have otherwise been a celebratory time.
You could just see a ripped, shredded, and geologically modified canyon where rocks the size of cars had been tumbling down the river bottom. The road had been, in many parts of the canyon, totally removed.
Governor Richard Lamb established the Big Thompson Recovery Planning Council. They had 2 questions that kind of garnered most of their attention. Is US 34 going to be rebuilt? And if so, where? And then the second one, is there going to be floodplain zoning? And if so, how much? The notion that US Highway 34 contributed to channelization and to flooding risk was on the minds of people. But under the Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1974, only the original route would be reimbursed 100% for the road. And so if you are going to rebuild it, it makes economic sense to rebuild it in the same place.
Then there's all the questions of compensation and anguished homeowners who are frustrated in every way and whose lives have been disordered and who expect something to make up for their losses of property with some form of compensation. So there's a lot of tension and difficulty in dealing with governmental officials. And then there's also careful consideration of who should rebuild and who shouldn't.
The Colorado Land Use Commission said that, taking the recommendation from the Army Corps of Engineers that this place needs to be zoned. What they found is that under the floodplain laws, you can make two designations. You have a floodway zone, which is a higher risk zone, and under this, any building that has been destroyed or has more than 50% of damage cannot be rebuilt under any circumstances. And then you have a flood fringe zone, which is a lesser risk zone.
Larimer County said if your house is more than 50% damage, it has to go. And if you don't do it now, we won't be back to tear your house down. You'll have to pay to get that done. Those poor people that were in that position had to have them tore down. And a lot of people had them tore down, then they couldn't build back. They couldn't build it back. My thinking has always been, if you want to live on that river and take that chance because you love that river so much, then why can't they do that?
Some of them stood there in the canyon for as much as 20 years before they were either removed or restored. There was lawsuits, of course, going on, legal actions, estate problems, and this caused some great heartburn, some great angst, and true hostilities and anger that our systems had to weigh through and try to come up with a fair and equitable approach to dealing with this.
Where our cabin was located, we were not allowed to rebuild. And there was only one, maybe two cabins in the whole canyon that had flood insurance at that time. We just lost everything. Of course, we lost our car. There was a lot lost that evening. Those things are so insignificant in comparison to your children.
But years went by and I could never forget her. I always had dreams of her, and for the longest time I hated this river. Hated it. It took something from me I couldn't get back. Mom had flowers for my birthday, and I picked one of the roses out and I headed for the river. And I took a petal one at a time off of that rose. And Mom and Dad were there, and I said my goodbyes. My mom started realizing that she too hadn't healed, and a lot of other people didn't have time after that flood. So we started having the memorial services every year.
We saw how important it was to the people that we never let that be forgotten. We have a memorial service every year on July 31st, no matter the day, at 7 o'clock at the memorial site.
It takes a long time to come to grips with the magnitude of it. It's a hard thing to describe unless you've been through something like this.
I've never missed any of those memorials. We've gone to them every year. They have them. Kind of comforting to me, I guess, to see as many of them as more than I thought survived the flood.
The main purpose of doing that every year is that we don't forget the memory of all those that lost their lives that night.
If you have a catastrophe and you don't take lessons from it, then it's an even worse catastrophe.
It changed the way that we thought about flood warning and predicting weather systems. After the Big Thompson flood, the National Weather Service created many more rain monitoring stations in the Rocky Mountains. The Colorado Department of Highways began putting in warning signs instructing people what to do in the event of a flash flood, to tell people to climb to high ground. The government became much more particular about where homeowners could actually build.
We learned that certain meteorological conditions which occurred that day, from that a whole new field of flood meteorology sort of emerged, of what are now called flood warning systems or alert systems, where there's automated rain gauges in different parts of the Front Range of Colorado. That's when they started to learn reverse 911 systems to at least call home phone numbers. And now, of course, that happens on our cell phones, which is why a lot of us get flood messages on a regular basis.
Big Thompson Canyon 76 was hard to forget. Our protocols did change immediately, and they stayed changed through all those years.
Without the customs, operations, assumptions, precautions that came into play because of the Big Thompson flood, well, who knows how many would have died in 2013.
How could you possibly go through 2 floods in that time, in 40 years?
All the things that were learned in the years following the 76 flood got to be put to use with the 2013 flood. There were definitely much more aggressive warning, with information being delivered to people both by landline phones, cell phone communications, and in fact emergency managers driving ahead of the floods into the most sensitive areas and telling people to get out. The 2013 flood was different in that it was raining not so intensely, but over a much bigger area, and it took a longer time, and particularly when a new road was engineered and built that looked like it should withstand whatever nature could throw at it. And then to see it all ripped apart again within less than 40 years, we're like, whoa, how could this be?
Having no clue that it would come in that heavy or that extended and that long. But we started doing the protocols that we learned in 76 that night. That helped measurably. But we had time in 2013 to see what was coming, and we appreciated what was coming. And we had time to do measured rescues and to get people out of harm's way and to close roads down and to disallow any traffic.
And people did listen this time when we had our 2013 flood. They got phone calls. It was a whole different thing. It rained for 3 days solid. We had 21 inches, 22 inches of rain here.
I feared this flood coming. I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime. I built an addition, but I built it 5.5 feet off the ground. And I built a good, strong foundation around it. That was the part of the house that didn't get washed away.
I happened to move back in time to watch the 2013 flood from a totally different perspective. And I stood and watched something I hadn't seen. I couldn't leave. People wanted me to leave. I knew I was safe. I knew I could climb to higher ground. But I had to see it all again. This time through an adult's eyes. And to realize I couldn't have saved him.
And the flood in September of 2013 just destroyed everything up there. Our houses are still there. They were just gutted and just destroyed. All of our hard work for all those years just going down the river.
It was pretty obvious when I got into the EOC that morning that it was worse. Worse than Big Thompson because of the area involved and the destruction up into Estes and all the way down Highway 7. What wasn't worse by any stretch of the imagination was the death toll.
But fewer lives were lost, 144 in 1976 and 10 in 2013.
In our canyon, in the Big Thompson, we lost 2 people, and they were right over here in Cedar Cove.
In the Big Thompson Canyon during the 2013 floods, you have 17 of the 25 miles of US Highway 34 disintegrated for the price tag of $80 million. You have hundreds of homes that are again destroyed.
The State Historical Fund worked very diligently with property owners after the 2013 flood. There were some historical buildings that were right on the verge of being lost.
History Colorado and local preservationists worked diligently to save as many historic buildings as possible in the canyon and beyond. History Colorado's preservation staff coordinated with many of the towns, conducting surveys and determining which buildings were of historic importance. Then, along with Colorado Preservation, Inc., the State Historical Fund collaborated to help those most affected by granting funds, helping owners save their properties. Little Church in the Pines, originally built in 1902, was severely damaged in the 2013 flood, and its preservation serves as a lasting example of these efforts. As a result of the flood, action plans are now in place, ready to save buildings the next time disaster strikes.
More and more people are building and improving in flood zones. That means that the property damage in 2013 was higher by far than the property damage in 1976. And only 35 million in 76 and 80 million or so in 2013.
It's worth remembering the flood, not only to honor the people who died during the deluge, but also the kind of warning that the flood provides that there are vulnerabilities to people with flooding all along Front Range communities. Learning that certain land use patterns come with certain vulnerabilities can help people prepare in the future.
It would be nice to say that after the Big Thompson flood of 1976 that we learned our lesson, that we never made the mistake of building in a way that would allow nature to destroy lives and property again.
We have so many more tools today than we did in 76 to really read what the situation is and how to react to it and how to warn people.
Now there are literally 5 radar who give us much better overall coverage, so much better than what we had in 76.
We have multiple people with cell phones, which is huge, and texting and social media and on and on and on. We've got the warning capability of reverse 911 and the emergency phone notification systems.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that Colorado weather, beautiful as it is most of the time, can throw some really nasty stuff at us. And often, even with improved warnings, it may still be a very short warning. So the best warning you may get is from your own eyes, your own senses, your own knowledge of the situation. So you just have to be on the lookout.
Nature's pretty horrific sometimes, you know. Hurricanes, tornadoes, and people try to build back. I had to file bankruptcy. We don't have any income now because it's all washed away. And then people ask me, why smile? Are you 2 floods? Why are you still here? You know, but it's home. We've been there 40 years and 5 generations on that property up there. 2 floods and you couldn't put me anywhere else. You know, I don't want it, it's home.
The Big Thompson flood of 1976 was a very significant event in Colorado history. It was a late 20th century reminder of the power of nature.
The power of that river and the destruction, it's seared into the memory of almost all residents, especially in Larimer County. Town of Loveland, Fort Collins, Estes Park, what used to be Drake.
If we hadn't lost any people at all, it would have just been a flood. I want to make sure that those people are not forgotten.
We've all moved on in our own different ways, but we don't ever want to forget one of those lives that were lost that night. Every day I think about Aaron, and I treasure every minute and every memory that I have of Aaron.
We have found from our historical records that we get a storm like that somewhere up and down the Front Range about once in 10 years.
It's important to remember 76 and 2013 in Big Thompson Canyon because not only could it happen again, but you need to pass that on and you need to tell friends and neighbors about what happened 20 years from now if it's raining really hard that day. There's a body of knowledge which will help people in the future.
It seems to some of us like really only yesterday, and then we think of all the things that have changed, the transportation, communications, population. So much of Colorado is different, and yet the mountains are the same.
I no longer hate the river. I have learned to respect it, to understand it, and I still see the beauty in it. It's still peaceful. It was a disaster. There's nothing we had control over, nothing I could have changed.
In that 76 flood, I was just hanging on for life. That's what we do here sometimes. We just hang on for life. Just hang on long enough to keep going. I just realized that, you know, you can die in a second. You can be gone. So why don't you just kick back, look at your life, and think, okay, what's important? Because you might not get a chance if you don't do what you want to do.